Sarah Martinez wiped her hands on the kitchen towel, glancing at the clock above the stove. It was nearly midnight and her husband David still wasn't home from his shift. She had grown accustomed to these late nights over their 8 years of marriage. Being married to someone who worked unpredictable hours meant dinner alone, sleeping in an empty bed, and constantly worrying about safety. The small suburban house felt too quiet as she moved through her evening routine. Their golden retriever, Max, followed her from room to room, sensing her restless energy. Sarah had tried calling David twice, but both calls went straight to voicemail. This wasn't unusual, but tonight something felt different. A nagging feeling sat in her stomach that she couldn't shake. She settled into the living room with a cup of chamomile tea, hoping it would calm her nerves. The local news played softly in the background, reporting the usual mix of traffic accidents and city council meetings. Sarah found herself checking her phone every few minutes, scrolling through social media to distract herself from the growing anxiety. The couple had been trying to start a family for the past 2 years. The stress of failed attempts, doctor visits, and hormone treatments had taken a toll on both of them. David had been working extra shifts to help pay for the fertility treatments, which meant even less time together. Sarah often wondered if the distance between them was affecting their chances of conceiving. She thought about their conversation from the morning. David had seemed distracted, barely touching his breakfast before rushing out the door. When she asked if everything was okay, he just kissed her forehead and mumbled something about a busy day ahead. Looking back, she realized he had been acting strange for the past week. Their neighborhood in Riverside was typically quiet, filled with young families and retirees who kept to themselves. Sarah had always felt safe here, even when David worked nights. The tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns gave her a sense of security that she treasured. Most of their neighbors knew David's profession and often waved when they saw his patrol car in the driveway. As she finished her tea, Sarah decided to take Max for a quick walk around the block. The fresh air might help clear her head and tire her out enough to sleep. She grabbed his leash from the hook by the front door and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and she could hear the distant hum of traffic from the main road. During their walk, Sarah noticed Mrs. Henderson from next door peeking through her curtains. The elderly woman often kept watch over the neighborhood, though she was too polite to be considered nosy. Sarah waved, and Mrs. Henderson waved back before disappearing behind the fabric. It was comforting to know someone was always paying attention to the comings and goings on their street. When they returned home, Sarah checked her phone again. Still no message from David. She tried calling one more time, but again it went to voicemail. This time she left a message asking him to call her back when he got a chance, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. She didn't want to seem clingy or paranoid, but the feeling in her gut was getting stronger. She decided to take a warm bath, hoping the hot water would relax her tense muscles. As she soaked in the tub, surrounded by lavender-scented bubbles, Sarah's mind wandered to their early days together. They had met at a coffee shop downtown where she worked as a barista during college. David was fresh out of the police academy, young and eager to make a difference in the world. Their courtship had been sweet and simple. David would stop by the coffee shop during his lunch breaks, always ordering the same black coffee and leaving generous tips. It took him 3 weeks to work up the courage to ask her out. Their first date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant, where they talked for hours about their dreams and goals. After finishing her bath, Sarah put on her favorite pajamas and climbed into bed. She left the bedside lamp on, hoping David would be home soon. Max curled up on his bed in the corner of the room, but she could tell he was also waiting for David's return. The dog always got excited when he heard the patrol car pulling into the driveway. As she lay in the darkness, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe David was working a complicated case that required overtime. Perhaps there was an emergency that kept him busy. She tried to push away the darker thoughts that crept into her consciousness. The police force had been dealing with increased tensions in the city, and officers were under more scrutiny than ever before. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, bright lights were flashing through the bedroom window. Sarah sat up quickly, her heart pounding as she tried to understand what was happening. The red and blue lights painted the walls in alternating colors, and she could hear car doors slamming outside. Grabbing her robe, Sarah rushed to the front window and carefully pulled back the curtain. 3 police cars were parked in front of her house, their emergency lights still flashing. Her blood ran cold as she saw 4 officers walking up her front walkway. Max started barking from the bedroom, sensing the commotion outside. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to process what she was seeing. Why were police officers at her door at this hour? Where was David? 1,000 terrible scenarios flashed through her mind as she stood frozen behind the curtain, watching the officers approach her front door. The lead officer raised his hand to knock, and Sarah felt her world begin to crumble around her. The heavy knock echoed through the house like thunder. Sarah's legs felt weak as she made her way to the front door, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. Through the peephole, she could see the distorted face of a uniformed officer, his expression serious and professional. Behind him, she could make out the shapes of 3 other officers standing on her porch. Her hand hovered over the deadbolt, paralyzed by fear. Every police spouse knew this moment could come. The late-night visit, the solemn faces, the words that would change everything forever. Sarah had attended too many funerals for fallen officers, had comforted too many widows who had stood exactly where she was standing now. The officer knocked again, more insistent this time. Sarah forced herself to unlock the door, her fingers fumbling with the chain latch. When she finally opened it, the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of exhaust and the distant sound of radio chatter from the patrol cars. "Mrs. Martinez?" The lead officer, a middle-aged man with graying temples, spoke gently but with authority. His nameplate read Sergeant Collins. Sarah nodded, unable to find her voice. She noticed how the other officers positioned themselves slightly behind Collins, their faces carefully neutral. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Collins with the Riverside Police Department. We need to speak with you about your husband, Officer David Martinez." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. "Is he—" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. She couldn't finish the question, couldn't give voice to her worst fear. Sergeant Collins's expression softened slightly, and he glanced at his colleagues before looking back at her. "Ma'am, may we come inside? This isn't really a conversation for the porch." Sarah stepped back automatically, allowing the 4 officers to enter her living room. They moved with practiced efficiency, their boots loud on the hardwood floor. Max appeared from the hallway, tail wagging, confused by the late-night visitors. Sarah sank into the armchair where she had been sitting just hours before, her legs unable to support her weight any longer. The officers remained standing, their presence filling the small room. Sergeant Collins pulled out a small notebook, and Sarah noticed his hands were steady while hers continued to shake. "Mrs. Martinez, when did you last speak with your husband?" Collins asked, his pen poised over the paper. Sarah tried to think clearly, but her mind felt foggy with panic. "This morning?" she managed, "before he left for work, around 7:30. She paused, remembering their brief interaction. "He seemed distracted, but I didn't think much of it. He's been working a lot of overtime lately." The officers exchanged glances, and Sarah caught the subtle communication between them. Whatever was happening, they all knew more than they were telling her. The younger officer near the window kept checking his radio, as if expecting an update. "Has David mentioned any problems at work? Any conflicts with colleagues or issues with cases he was working on?" Collins continued his questioning methodically. Sarah shook her head, trying to remember any conversations that might be relevant. "He doesn't usually talk about work details," she said. "Department policy, you know. But he seemed stressed lately. We've been going through fertility treatments, and the medical bills have been piling up. He's been picking up extra shifts to help cover the costs." One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah noticed him glance toward the family photos on the mantelpiece. The images showed happier times, their wedding day, vacation trips, holiday gatherings with family. In every photo, David's smile was genuine and bright, his arm protectively around Sarah's shoulders. "Mrs. Martinez," Collins said carefully, "we received a call tonight about an incident involving your husband. There was an altercation during a traffic stop, and David has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." Sarah felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked her over. Administrative leave meant David was alive. It meant whatever had happened, it wasn't the worst-case scenario she had imagined, but relief quickly gave way to confusion and new fears. "What kind of altercation?" she asked. "Is David hurt? Where is he now?" The questions tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. Collins held up a hand to slow her down. David is physically unharmed, he assured her. But the incident is serious and there are some concerns about his state of mind. The department psychiatrist wants to evaluate him before he returns to duty. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process this information. David had always been solid, reliable, professional. In 8 years on the force, he had never had any complaints filed against him. His supervisors praised his dedication and level-headedness. What could have happened to change that? I need to see him, Sarah said, standing up abruptly. Where is he? Can you take me to him? Collins shook his head sympathetically. That's not possible right now, ma'am. David is being interviewed by Internal Affairs and then he'll likely be released to go home. We expect that to be sometime in the next few hours. The waiting was torture. Sarah paced around the living room while the officers continued their questions. They wanted to know about David's recent behavior, his sleep patterns, whether he had been drinking more than usual or seemed depressed. Each question felt like an accusation, and Sarah found herself becoming defensive. David is a good cop, she insisted. Whatever happened tonight, there must be an explanation. He would never do anything to harm an innocent person. The officers nodded politely, but Sarah could see the skepticism in their eyes. As the interview continued, neighbors began to notice the commotion. Sarah could see porch lights coming on up and down the street, and she caught glimpses of faces peering through windows. Mrs. Henderson was standing on her front porch in her bathrobe, making no attempt to hide her curiosity. The reality of the situation began to sink in. Whatever had happened tonight would become neighborhood gossip by morning. David's reputation, their privacy, their standing in the community, everything was about to change. Sarah felt sick thinking about facing her co-workers, her family, the other police wives who would inevitably hear about this incident. After what felt like hours of questioning, the officers finally prepared to leave. Sergeant Collins handed Sarah his business card and assured her that someone from the department would be in touch within 24 hours. As the patrol cars pulled away from the curb, their flashing lights finally dark, Sarah found herself alone with her racing thoughts and mounting dread. She tried calling David's cell phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. His phone was probably confiscated as part of the investigation. Sarah had no way to reach him, no way to know when he would come home or what condition he would be in when he arrived. The uncertainty was eating her alive. Unable to sleep, Sarah made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She considered calling her sister Maria, but it was nearly 3 a.m. Besides, what would she say? That her husband was involved in some kind of police incident, but she didn't know any details? That their perfect life was suddenly falling apart and she had no idea why? The house felt different now, tainted by the presence of the investigating officers and the weight of unspoken accusations. Sarah walked through the rooms, touching familiar objects as if they could anchor her to the reality she knew. The wedding photo on the bedroom dresser, David's police academy graduation certificate hanging in the hallway, the coffee mug he used every morning sitting clean in the dish rack. As dawn approached, Sarah heard a car in the driveway. She rushed to the window and saw David's personal vehicle, a blue Ford pickup truck pulling up to the garage. Her heart hammered as she watched him sit in the driver's seat for several minutes before getting out. Even from a distance, she could see the exhaustion in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged with defeat. When David finally walked through the front door, Sarah was shocked by his appearance. His usually neat uniform was wrinkled and disheveled. His face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look years older. Most disturbing was his expression, vacant and distant, as if he was looking through her rather than at her. "David," Sarah whispered, moving toward him. He stopped in the entryway, not meeting her eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and fears. Max trotted over to greet his favorite human, but even the dog seemed to sense something was wrong. "They told me officers came here," David said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." He moved past her toward the kitchen, his movements mechanical and detached. Sarah followed, desperate to bridge the growing distance between them. "What happened, David? Please just tell me what happened." Sarah's voice broke on the last words. She needed him to look at her, to connect with her, to be the man she married. Instead, David poured himself a glass of water and stared out the kitchen window at their backyard. "There was a traffic stop," he said flatly. "Things went wrong. I'm suspended pending investigation." The clinical way he delivered the information made Sarah's blood run cold. This wasn't how David usually talked to her. Where was the warmth, the intimacy, the partnership they had built over 8 years together? "What do you mean things went wrong?" Sarah pressed. "Were you hurt? Was someone else hurt?" David's jaw tightened and she saw him grip the counter with white knuckles. "I can't talk about it," he said. "Internal affairs, lawyers, procedures. You know how it works." But Sarah didn't know how it worked, not really. David had always been careful to keep the darker aspects of his job separate from their home life. Now she was being thrust into a world she didn't understand. The phone rang, startling them both. David looked at the caller ID and declined the call without answering. Within seconds it rang again. This time Sarah could see it was from a number she didn't recognize. David turned off the phone entirely and set it on the counter. "It's starting," he said grimly. "The media circus. Someone probably leaked my name already." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't considered that their private nightmare might become public entertainment. Over the next few hours, David's prediction proved accurate. The house phone rang constantly with calls from reporters wanting statements. Cars began driving slowly past their house, some stopping to take pictures. Sarah closed all the curtains and felt like a prisoner in her own home. David retreated to their bedroom and stayed there for most of the day. When Sarah brought him lunch, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. His police uniform hung in the closet, visible through the open door, looking somehow accusatory in the afternoon light. "I've been thinking," David said without preamble, "maybe you should go stay with your sister for a while. Until this blows over." The suggestion hit Sarah like a slap. In all their years together, even during their worst arguments, David had never asked her to leave. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said firmly, sitting down beside him on the bed. "We're married. We face this together." But David shook his head, still not meeting her eyes. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't going to just blow over. My career is finished. Our reputation is destroyed. Everything we've worked for is gone." The defeat in his voice was heartbreaking. Sarah tried to reach for his hand, but David pulled away from her touch. The rejection stung more than any of the harsh words. They had always been physically affectionate, always comfortable with casual touches and embraces. Now there was a wall between them that she didn't know how to scale. That evening, Maria called. She had seen a brief news report about an officer-involved incident and wanted to make sure everything was okay. Sarah found herself lying to her sister, saying everything was fine while David paced in the background like a caged animal. After dinner, which David barely touched, Sarah tried again to get him to open up. She needed to understand what had happened, needed to know how bad the situation really was. But David remained stubbornly silent, deflecting her questions and avoiding her gaze. As they prepared for bed, Sarah noticed David taking out clothes for the next day, civilian clothes instead of his uniform. The sight of him hanging up a regular shirt and khaki pants where his police uniform usually hung was somehow more devastating than anything else that had happened. It made the suspension feel real and permanent. 3 days passed in a blur of tension and silence. David spent most of his time locked away in his home office, supposedly preparing for his meeting with internal affairs. Sarah tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, going to work at the accounting firm where she managed client files. But concentration was impossible. Her co-workers had begun asking careful questions about the news reports, and Sarah found herself making excuses to avoid the break room conversations. The media attention had died down somewhat, but Sarah still noticed the occasional car driving slowly past their house. Mrs. Henderson had stopped waving when she saw Sarah in the yard, and the mail carrier seemed to hurry past their mailbox. The isolation was suffocating. On Thursday morning, Sarah decided she couldn't take the silence anymore. She called in sick to work and confronted David directly. She found him in the garage methodically cleaning tools that were already spotless, his movements robotic and purposeless. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Really talk. I can't live like this anymore." David continued organizing screwdrivers in size order, not acknowledging her presence. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied mechanically. "I'm meeting with IA tomorrow. After that, we'll know where things stand." His detachment was maddening. Sarah wanted to shake him, to force him to look at her and remember that she was his wife, not a stranger. "I don't care about internal affairs," Sarah said, stepping closer. "I care about us, about what this is doing to our marriage." You're shutting me out and I don't understand why. David finally stopped his busy work and turned to face her, but his expression remained closed off. Because there's nothing you can do to fix this, he said harshly. Nothing anyone can do. My career is over, Sarah. Everything I've worked for since I was 18 years old is gone. The house, the car payments, your fertility treatments. How do you think we're going to afford any of that now? The mention of the fertility treatments hit Sarah particularly hard. They had been so hopeful just a week ago, planning their next round of hormone injections and discussing baby names. Now that future felt impossibly distant, another casualty of whatever had happened during that traffic stop. We'll figure it out, Sarah said desperately. Other couples get through difficult times. We can too, but not if you won't let me help, not if you won't even tell me what happened. David's face hardened, and Sarah saw a flash of something she had never seen before, anger directed at her. You want to know what happened? David's voice rose. Fine, I pulled over a speeding car. Routine traffic stop. The driver was belligerent, started arguing, reached for something in his glove compartment. For a split second, I thought it might be a weapon. I drew my gun. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had known it involved a weapon, but hearing David say it made everything more real and more terrifying. But it wasn't a weapon, David continued bitterly. It was his registration. The guy was just trying to get his paperwork and I had my gun pointed at his head. The whole thing was recorded on my body camera. You can see the exact moment I realized my mistake, see the fear in that man's eyes. The anguish in David's voice broke Sarah's heart. She could imagine how traumatic the experience must have been for everyone involved. But she also knew her husband, knew his training and his judgment. There had to be more to the story. That doesn't sound like grounds for suspension, Sarah said carefully. Officers draw their weapons all the time when they feel threatened. What aren't you telling me? David's jaw clenched and Sarah knew she was pushing him toward something he didn't want to share. The man was black, David said quietly. 19 years old, driving his mother's car home from his job at the grocery store. Clean record. No criminal history, just a kid who was running late and driving a little too fast. He paused, running his hands through his hair. And there's video of the whole thing going viral on social media. Sarah felt sick. She understood now why the media attention had been so intense, why David was convinced his career was over. In the current climate, any incident involving police and racial tensions became national news. Even if David had followed proper procedure, even if he had genuinely feared for his safety, the optics were devastating. Oh, David, Sarah whispered, finally understanding the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about internal affairs or department procedures. This was about public perception, community relations, and political pressures that went far beyond anything they could control. The kid's mother was on the news yesterday, David continued, his voice hollow, talking about how scared her son was, how he called her crying after it happened. She's a nurse at the children's hospital, works double shifts to support her family, and I pointed a gun at her baby for trying to show me his registration. Sarah wanted to comfort him, to find words that would ease his guilt and self-recrimination, but she also knew that platitudes wouldn't help. David was grappling with something that challenged his identity as both a police officer and a decent human being. That afternoon, David's union representative called to schedule a meeting. The conversation was brief and professional, but Sarah could hear the concern in the man's voice. Even the union seemed worried about the outcome of the investigation. Sarah spent the evening researching similar cases online, trying to understand what they might be facing. The stories she found were not encouraging. Officers involved in controversial incidents, even those who were eventually cleared of wrongdoing, often faced years of scrutiny and career limitations. Some left law enforcement entirely, unable to cope with the stress and public hostility. The financial implications were staggering. David's salary was their primary income, and his benefits covered Sarah's fertility treatments. If he lost his job, they would likely lose their health insurance, their house, and any chance of starting the family they desperately wanted. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to David toss and turn beside her. She could tell he wasn't sleeping either, probably replaying the incident over and over in his mind. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer physical comfort if emotional connection was too difficult, but the distance between them felt vast and unbridgeable. Around 3 a.m, Sarah heard David get up and leave the bedroom. She found him in the living room, sitting in his chair with Max at his feet staring at nothing. The sight of him looking so lost and defeated brought tears to her eyes. "I keep thinking about that kid," David said without looking at her, wondering if he'll ever feel safe around police officers again. Wondering what I've done to his trust in the system. The pain in his voice was unbearable. Sarah sat down on the couch across from him, giving him space but staying close enough that he would know she wasn't abandoning him. They sat in silence until dawn began to creep through the windows. Two people who loved each other but had no idea how to bridge the chasm that one terrible moment had created between them. The internal affairs meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at police headquarters. David left the house that morning wearing his best suit, looking more like he was attending a funeral than a professional meeting. Sarah wanted to drive him there for moral support, but David insisted on going alone. He said he needed to face this on his own terms. While David was gone, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on anything. She cleaned the house obsessively, organized closets that didn't need organizing, and baked cookies they wouldn't eat. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from imagining worst-case scenarios. Around noon, her phone rang. It was Detective Linda Rodriguez, David's former partner who had been reassigned when David was suspended. Linda and Sarah had become friends over the years, bonding at department barbecues and holiday parties. "Hey, Sarah," Linda's voice was cautious. "I wanted to check on you guys. I know this has been a rough week." Sarah was grateful to hear from someone who understood the unique pressures of police work. "It's been hell," Sarah admitted. "David won't talk to me about what happened. I feel like I'm losing my husband along with everything else." Linda was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear radio chatter in the background. "I can't talk about the specifics of the case," Linda said carefully, "but I can tell you that David is a good cop. One of the best I've worked with. What happened that night? It could have happened to any of us. Split-second decisions, adrenaline, imperfect information. That's the reality of police work." Linda's words provided some comfort, but Sarah knew the department was under pressure to take action, regardless of the circumstances. Public opinion often mattered more than the facts when it came to police accountability. "Is there anything I can do?" Sarah asked. "Anyone I should call? I feel so helpless just sitting here waiting." Linda sighed, and Sarah could picture her shaking her head. "Just be there for him," Linda said. "This process is going to test everything he believes about himself and his career. He's going to need you more than he realizes, even if he's pushing you away right now." After Linda hung up, Sarah decided to do something productive. She called their insurance company to understand their options if David lost his job. The conversation was depressing. They would have 60 days of coverage under COBRA, but the premiums would be nearly impossible to afford on Sarah's salary alone. She also researched other career options for David. His military experience and police training would translate well to private security, but the pay would be significantly less than his current salary. Federal agencies sometimes hired former local police officers, but background investigations could take months, and David's recent incident would certainly be scrutinized. Around 4 o'clock, Sarah heard David's truck in the driveway. She watched through the window as he sat in the vehicle for several minutes before getting out. His body language told her everything she needed to know. Shoulders slumped, head down, movements slow and deliberate. The meeting had not gone well. David entered the house through the garage, avoiding the front door where neighbors might see him. Sarah met him in the kitchen, studying his face for clues about what had transpired. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the strain around his eyes. "How did it go?" Sarah asked gently. David loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of water before answering. "They're recommending termination," he said flatly. "Excessive force, failure to de-escalate, bringing discredit to the department. The usual charges when they want to make an example of someone." His voice was devoid of emotion, as if he was reporting someone else's news. Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. They had both known termination was possible, but hearing it stated so bluntly was devastating. 8 years of service, commendations, community involvement, none of it mattered now. "What about the union?" Sarah asked. "Can't they appeal? Fight the recommendation?" David shook his head tiredly. "The union rep thinks we should take whatever deal they offer, maybe get it reduced to resignation instead of termination, preserve some benefits, avoid a drawn-out fight that we'll probably lose anyway." He sat heavily at the kitchen table, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. Sarah sat down across from him, reaching for his hand. This time he didn't pull away, but his fingers were cold and limp in hers. The physical contact felt foreign after days of distance between them. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. David was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands. "I have a week to decide," he said finally. "Accept resignation with limited benefits or fight termination and risk losing everything." The impossible choice hung between them like a weight. That evening, David's phone started ringing again. Word of the internal affairs recommendation had leaked, and reporters wanted his response. David turned off his phone and disconnected the house line, but they could see news vans beginning to gather on their street again. Sarah closed all the curtains and they ate dinner by lamplight, feeling like fugitives in their own home. The local news was leading with David's story, showing file footage of the police station and interviewing community leaders about police accountability. Sarah changed the channel, but David stopped her. "I need to see it," he said grimly. "I need to know what people are saying." They watched in silence as David's supervisor gave a carefully worded statement about the department's commitment to proper procedure and community trust. The most painful part was an interview with the young man's mother. She spoke eloquently about her son's fear, about the trauma of having a gun pointed at him for a simple traffic violation. Sarah could see the genuine pain in the woman's eyes, and she understood why David was so consumed with guilt. "She has every right to be angry," David said quietly. "I would feel the same way if someone did that to our child." The reference to the family they might never have now brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. Later that night, Sarah found David standing in their bedroom closet, staring at his dress uniform hanging in its protective bag. The uniform he had worn to promotion ceremonies, award presentations, and fallen officer funerals. The uniform that represented everything he had wanted to be since he was a boy dreaming of serving his community. "I used to be so proud to put that on," David said softly. "I thought I was making a difference, protecting people, upholding justice. Now I wonder if I was just fooling myself." Sarah moved to stand beside him, looking at the uniform that had once symbolized honor and service. "You did make a difference," Sarah said firmly. "You've helped people, saved lives, kept our community safe. One mistake doesn't erase 8 years of good service." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew that David's mistake would define his legacy more than all his good deeds combined. "The kid's name is Marcus," David said suddenly. "Marcus Johnson, 19 years old, studying pre-med at the community college. Dreams of becoming a doctor like his grandfather." Sarah realized that David had been researching the young man, learning about his life and aspirations. "I destroyed his trust in police officers," David continued. "Made him afraid of the very people who are supposed to protect him. How do I live with that?" The question hung in the air unanswered, because Sarah didn't know how anyone could live with that kind of guilt. As they prepared for bed, Sarah knew that their marriage was at a crossroads. The man she had fallen in love with was disappearing before her eyes, consumed by guilt and self-doubt. She could either fight to save him and their relationship, or watch helplessly as everything they had built together crumbled under the weight of one terrible moment. The weekend brought no relief from the pressure. David spent Saturday morning meeting with a lawyer recommended by the police union. The attorney was experienced in defending officers against misconduct charges, but his assessment was blunt. Fighting termination would be expensive, time-consuming, and likely unsuccessful, given the current political climate. Sarah used the time alone to make difficult phone calls. She contacted their mortgage company to discuss payment options if David lost his income. She researched food banks and social services in their area. She even looked into second jobs she could take to supplement her income. The conversation with her fertility clinic was the hardest, indefinitely postponing their treatments due to financial uncertainty. When David returned from the lawyer's office, his decision was written on his face. He had aged years in the span of a week, and Sarah could see that his spirit was broken. The fight had gone out of him completely. "I'm going to resign," David announced as he sat heavily on their couch. "Take whatever benefits they're offering and try to move on with my life." Sarah had expected this decision, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked gently. "Maybe if you fought it, if people heard your side of the story." David shook his head before she could finish. "What story, Sarah? That I drew my weapon on an unarmed teenager because I was scared?" That I saw a young black man reaching for something and assumed the worst? There's no version of this story that makes me look like anything other than exactly what people think I am. The self-loathing in David's voice was heartbreaking. Sarah moved to sit beside him on the couch, close enough to touch but giving him space to process his emotions. Max sensed the tension and laid his head on David's lap, offering the simple comfort that only a loyal dog could provide. "You're not a racist, David," Sarah said firmly. "You're not a bad person. You made a split-second decision in a high-stress situation. It was a mistake, but it doesn't define who you are." David stroked Max's head absently, his eyes focused on something Sarah couldn't see. "Doesn't it, though?" David asked quietly. "When it matters most, when someone's life and safety are in my hands, I failed. I let fear and assumptions cloud my judgment. Maybe I shouldn't be a police officer if I can't do better than that." On Sunday, David's resignation letter was hand-delivered to police headquarters. The union representative called that evening to confirm that the department had accepted the resignation and would process his final paycheck and limited benefits. 8 years of service reduced to a personnel file and a pension calculation. The media response was mixed. Some community leaders praised the quick resolution and David's willingness to accept responsibility. Others criticized the department for allowing him to resign instead of facing termination. David refused to read any of the coverage, but Sarah found herself obsessively checking news websites and social media comments. Monday morning brought a strange sense of normalcy. For the first time in over a week, David got up at his usual time and got dressed. But instead of putting on his police uniform, he wore jeans and a polo shirt. Instead of driving to the police station, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the classified ads. "I was thinking about security work," David said as Sarah prepared to leave for her job. "Maybe corporate security or working for one of those private investigation firms." Sarah could hear him trying to inject optimism into his voice, but it sounded forced and hollow. "Whatever you want to do," Sarah replied supportively. "We'll figure it out together." She kissed his forehead before leaving, but the gesture felt stilted and unfamiliar. They were going through the motions of being a married couple, but the easy intimacy they had once shared seemed to have evaporated. At work, Sarah's supervisor called her into his office. Word of David's situation had reached her workplace, and there were concerns about how it might affect the firm's reputation. Sarah assured him that her personal problems wouldn't interfere with her professional responsibilities, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. Another casualty of the incident, her own career prospects were now tainted by association. That evening, Sarah came home to find David in the garage again, this time cleaning his personal firearms. The sight of him methodically disassembling and reassembling his pistol made her deeply uncomfortable. She had never worried about David's access to weapons before, but his current state of mind made everything feel dangerous and unpredictable. "David," Sarah said carefully, "maybe you should put those away for now, until you're feeling more like yourself." David looked up at her with surprise, then understanding dawned on his face. "I'm not going to hurt myself, Sarah," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to keep my hands busy, trying not to think." But Sarah noticed that he put the firearms away without argument, locking them in the gun safe and pocketing the key. On Tuesday, an unexpected visitor changed everything. Sarah answered the doorbell to find a young black woman standing on their porch. She was professionally dressed and carried herself with quiet dignity. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized who this must be. "Mrs. Martinez," the woman asked politely. "My name is Angela Johnson. I'm Marcus's mother. I was wondering if I could speak with your husband." Sarah's mouth went dry. Of all the scenarios she had imagined, a visit from the victim's mother had never occurred to her. She could hear David's footsteps behind her as he came to see who was at the door. When he saw Angela Johnson, his face went completely white. "Mrs. Johnson," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." Angela studied his face for a moment, taking in his obvious distress and remorse. "May I come in?" she asked. "I think we need to talk." Sarah stepped aside to let her enter, her mind racing with questions and fears. What did this woman want? Was she here to confront David? To threaten legal action? Angela Johnson was smaller than she had appeared on television, but her presence filled the room. She accepted Sarah's offer of coffee and sat gracefully on their living room couch. David remained standing as if he couldn't bring himself to relax in her presence. "Officer Martinez," Angela began, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. I heard about your resignation. David, I came here because my son asked me to." This revelation shocked both Sarah and David. Why would Marcus want his mother to visit the man who had traumatized him? "Marcus has been struggling since that night," Angela continued. "Not just with fear or anger, but with guilt. He keeps saying that he caused all this trouble for you, that he should have moved more slowly, should have announced what he was doing." David's face crumpled at this revelation. "He has nothing to feel guilty about," David said urgently. "Nothing at all. I'm the one who made the mistake. I'm the one who should have handled the situation better." Angela nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected him to say. "That's what I told him," she said. "But he's 19 years old and he's carrying this burden anyway. He asked me to come here and tell you that he forgives you, that he knows you're not a bad person, just someone who made a mistake under pressure." The words hit David like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, tears streaming down his face. Sarah had never seen her husband cry like this with such raw, uncontrolled emotion. Angela watched compassionately, allowing him time to process what she had told him. "I destroyed his future," David managed through his tears. "His trust in police, his sense of safety. How can he forgive that?" Angela leaned forward, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Because that's who my son is," she said simply. "And because he understands that carrying hatred and anger will only hurt him more. He wants to move forward, and he wants you to be able to move forward too." The visit lasted another hour, with Angela sharing stories about Marcus's dreams and aspirations, his determination to become a doctor, despite the financial challenges his family faced. She spoke about her own experiences with police officers, both positive and negative, and her belief that reform could only come through dialogue and understanding, rather than condemnation and division. When Angela prepared to leave, she stood and faced David directly. "My son wants to meet with you," she said. "When you're ready. Not for the media, not for anyone else. Just two people trying to heal from a terrible moment they shared." After she left, David and Sarah sat in stunned silence. The anger and guilt that had been consuming David for days seemed to have lifted slightly, replaced by something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of redemption. "She didn't have to come here," David said finally. "She could have let me destroy myself with guilt. Instead, she offered forgiveness I don't deserve." Sarah moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. "Maybe this is how we move forward," Sarah said softly. "Not by forgetting what happened, but by learning from it. By being better people because of it." David looked at her for the first time in days with something approaching the man she had married. "I want to meet with Marcus," David said. "I need to apologize to him directly, face to face. And I want to find a way to make this right somehow." Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling the first stirring of hope they had shared since that terrible night when the police cars appeared in their driveway.